Well, Acts 17 and 18 is what we're going to be covering tonight. And Acts 17 is probably one of my favorite chapters in the book. So I'm real excited to share some things that aren't real apparent to us in this book that just, to me, display how magnificent God is and has been all through human history. Setting the stage, the Emperor Claudius has come to power after Caligula. If you remember, Caligula was the emperor who kind of went nuts, got sick and went to his head, and he went nuts and made his horse the general of the army, and lasted about 2 years before the Praetorian Guard and a couple of senators conspired and had him, and assassinated him. And they wanted to vest the control of the Roman Empire away from the line of Caesar Augustus and Tiberius and Caligula and put it in someone else's hands. And so they selected a very distant cousin. His name was Claudius. He walked with a limp. He stuttered. A lot of people considered him to be sort of simple. And so they wanted an emperor that they could put in place and manipulate and run the government themselves, this little cabal. Don't go there, Cody. Yeah. He's grinning. But they wanted to, so they had this little they thought he was going to be just a puppet. Well, it turned out he was a very, very powerful ruler. And probably one of the best of the emperors from a secular perspective that Rome had. And so he comes to power, brings a relative period of stability and peace to the empire. And so the gospel during the time of Claudius really takes off. And we see that in Paul's travels in Acts 17 and 18. So Paul is now in Greece. He's on his second missionary journey. Last week we talked about Philippi. He was in Philippi. He'd come over because he had the Macedonian call. He had this dream of this man in Macedon saying, hey, come over and help us. And he goes across the Aegean Sea onto the Grecian peninsula, makes his way through Neapolis and Thermopolis and all the other polices, and winds up in Philippi. And we know what happened there. Founded a church, wound up in jail, sang a song at midnight, God set him free, and a whole family of people came to Christ because of it, and the little church at Philippi was established, and later he would write a letter to that church. That's the book of Philippians that we have in our New Testament. Well, from Philippi, he makes his way to Thessalonica. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Thessalonica because not too terribly long ago, we went through every chapter of both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Do you remember that series? And I talked quite a bit about the history of Thessalonica and Paul's experience there. He followed that typical MO. I'm going to go into the synagogue, I'll preach the gospel there, whoever listens will start meeting in other places, and Jews and Greeks are coming to Christ. And in Thessalonica, after being there for just 3 weeks, the Jews got jealous, the ones that refused to follow Jesus as Messiah. They stirred up a rabble, they ran Paul out, and he goes to Berea, which is about 42 miles away. And this is all on foot, remember. He makes his way to Berea, and the story in Berea is that the people there were more noble than the ones in Thessalonica, and they opened up the Word of God, and they considered what Paul had to say to stay. And he spent some time in Berea sharing the gospel with them. This was an interesting city. Berea was first mentioned by the Greek historian by the name of Thucydides in his history, and he talks at how the Athenians, and this is important for later because we're going to talk about Athens. The Athenians tried to take the city by siege in 432 during what were called the Peloponnesian War. Now, the two major city-states of Greece, this is like 400 years or so before Christ, the two main cities were Athens and Sparta. Athens was known as the cultural center, right? All the great, the things that Athens has contributed to even our form of government, our form of jurisprudence, education, everything. And Sparta, what was Sparta famous for? Military, they were a warrior caste, the whole city, the Spartans. They inspected every male baby, and if it didn't muster, didn't measure up to what they expected of a healthy male, they tossed it off a cliff. They were selective in, and every male was raised to be a warrior. Well, Sparta and Athens got into a war with each other, and the other Greek city-states took sides, and Berea sided with Sparta. So Athens tried to take Berea and failed. And so there was a lot of animosity between Berea and Athens after that. The city became part of the Roman Empire in 148 BC, and this city found favor with several of the Roman emperors and became an international city of varied races and religions. And this is what makes Greece so different. In Asia Minor, you have all these small little provinces. In Asia Minor was where Galatians were, Ephesus, Thyatira, Smyrna, Philadelphia, Sardis. All these, the cities are in modern-day Turkey. They all were kind of little cloisters to themselves. They each had their own little unique languages and dialects. Greece was not like that at all. Greece was a completely different context in which to share the gospel. A much more educated context, if you will. Affluent because of all the trade. You remember back several months now, I talked about Corinthians, and we talked about the city of Corinth and how it was this international hub of trade between the east and the west parts of the Roman Empire, and it was a big city for its time. And that's where Paul's going to wind up in Acts chapter 18. So Paul's in Berea. I'm picking up in your notes now at the very bottom of page 2. Acts 17:10, as soon as it was night, he's still in Thessalonica, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were more noble character than those of Thessalonica. They received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. And then the Jews in Thessalonica heard that Paul was just 42 miles away, and they were jealous, and they went over to Berea, and they stirred up a mob to chase Paul and Silas and Timothy out of Berea as well. So Paul and Silas, they stayed in Berea for a while, and Paul escaped and made his way down to Athens. And we're now in Athens. If you look at your little map on page 1 there, you can see where this whole journey starts, where Thessalonica is, and then to Berea. It's 500 kilometers, 316 miles from Berea to Athens. That was quite a jaunt. That would have taken several days to make that trip by foot. And so Paul he comes into Athens. And this city, Athens, again, as I mentioned, was kind of the cultural center of the Greek Empire and even a major cultural center in the Roman Empire. The city has been continuously occupied since before 3000 BC. It's one of the oldest cities in the world that still is a city today. 3,000 some odd years before Christ. So this city is 5,000 years old today. We can't relate to that. We think the War of 1812 is a long time ago. We can't imagine a city that's 5,000 years old, and Athens was. It was one of the most ancient cities in the world. It was established at least 1,000 years before Abraham, 1,500 years before Moses, 2,000 years before King David, 3,000 years before Christ. So this place has been around a while. The contribution that the Athenians made to Western civilization cannot be overstated. Have you ever served on a jury? How many of you have ever served on a jury in here or been summoned? That whole idea of jurisprudence and being tried by your peers comes from Athens. That came from Athens. You ever watch a movie? Drama, theater, performance. Athens, again, is the root of all of that. Ever read a novel? Well, you ever hear of a guy named Homer? He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey 1,000 years before Christ. Well, those were novels that he wrote in Athens. So all this rich cultural history comes to us today from this city. If you've ever spoken English or had a rational thought or gazed at the night sky in silent wonder, you can thank the ancient Greeks, because they're the ones that kind of started this whole thing, started pulling humanity in a way out of the doldrums of dark paganism. I mean, they're still pagans, but they were moving towards some sort of civilization. They brought us democracy, science, philosophy, written contracts, taxes, thank you very little, right? Writing and schools are all concepts and ideas that came out of Athens. In the Apostle Paul's day, the city was the center of cultural learning, the arts, and philosophy. And in Greece, it had a very proud heritage. It was also a city full of idols. The Athenians worshipped a pantheon of gods. They believed in the gods, but they didn't think that the Greek gods were the only ones. And so every time they got exposed to a new culture, they incorporated the gods of that culture and just added them to the pantheon. So there's this huge cadre of gods that the Athenians worshipped. And we don't want to think of worship in the term that we would normally you kind of visualize when we think worship. They respected and honored them. They didn't necessarily, to their own gods, their own personal, every Greek had their own little personal gods that they worshipped, and they would offer sacrifices. But culturally, there wasn't this, in Athens, this like big movement of worship towards any specific god. Now, Athena was the god of Athens. Athena, the goddess of wisdom in Greek mythology, but she was not venerated in the sense that we would think of it. It was like she was believed in and accepted, but not a big deal was made out of actually worshiping her. So the Apostle Paul is in Athens. He's making his way through Athens, and as he's walking through it, he was greatly distressed, the Bible says, to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. And so Paul had debates with the Jews. This is a city that's into philosophy and debate and exchanging ideas. And so he's having these debates with Jews and God-fearing Greeks in the synagogue, in the marketplace, and then he encounters a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers and begins to debate with them. Now, Epicureanism and Stoicism were the two main philosophical schools in ancient Greece and in Rome. The Epicureans believed that there was no real purpose to life, that the way to approach life is to get suck the marrow out of it. Get as much as you possibly can. Pursue every pleasure. Pursue everything that makes you happy and feel good. Because at the end of life, you're going to go to Tartarus and spend all of eternity, in the dark place of the god Hades. So why not enjoy this life? That's the one school. The other school was really the opposite. The Stoics believed, no, the purpose of life is to deny the flesh, to deny all those, to live lives of discipline and of chastity and of self-control and of giving and contributing and leaving a legacy behind you so that when you died, people would remember you well, and you still go to Tartarus. The end, both groups got to the same place. One just had a lot more fun getting there, is the way to kind of think of it. Those were the two main schools of thought. And so Paul gets into a debate with both of these groups of people and finds himself at a place called Mars Hill, the Areopagus. And Acts 17:22a, it's in your notes. Then Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God." Now we're familiar with this story, right? If you've been in the church, you've heard messages, or in your reading the Bible, you've come across this. And it would be real easy at this point to just conclude that the Athenians had so many gods, they just didn't want to miss one. And so they set up this altar to a god they might have missed, and this is for the unknown one, the one we didn't know about. But there's a story behind the story that I want to share with you that gives us a peek into God's heart for the nations, for the ethnos, as they were called, even before Christ came. So we have to go back 500 years before Christ. Athens is hit by a severe plague. Hundreds of people were dying daily in this city. They made sacrifices to all of their gods, hundreds of gods that the city had adopted, trying to appease the one that they had angered. The city council of Athens finally consulted the oracle, the Pythian oracle, which was the oracle was a young woman who took these hallucinogenics to help her get a vision into the world of the gods, to get understanding from them, and then tell people what they needed to do. And so they consulted the Pythian oracle, and she told them that the plague was because of King Megacles, who was one of the rulers of Athens. Megacles wanted to be a tyrant. And there was another member of the council whose name was Cylon. So Battlestar Galactica stole this by that name. His name was Cylon, and he had a group of followers who led a coup against Megacles. And Megacles' followers fought against Cylon's followers. Cylon was killed. Cylon's followers went into the temple of Athena, locked themselves in, and Megacles promised that, he said, "Okay, you guys did a bad thing. I forgive you. Come on out, and all will be well." Well, they took him at his word, and they should not have, because as soon as they opened the doors, Megacles and his followers slaughtered every one of those followers of Cylon. And so the Pythian oracle said that's the reason why that one of the gods is angry, because Megacles broke his word and slew innocent and unarmed people. And so the city council noted that they had made sacrifices to every single god in the city. They told the oracle, "But we sacrificed to every god. Which one's mad?" And the oracle said, "Well, you missed one. There's still one God who remains unappeased." And she said, "And I do not know his name." So she told the Athenians to send for a man named Epimenides. Epimenides lived in Knossos on the island of Crete. Now, the Athenians saw the Cretans as lowlifes, uneducated, single-toothed hillbillies. That was the Athenian picture of the people from Crete. And you want us to send to Crete, to this Cretan philosopher by the name of Epimenides, and he's going to come and tell us how to fix this. Surely there's somebody smart enough in Athens to do this. And she said, "No, you must bring Epimenides, seek him." So they went and found Epimenides and asked him if he would come and help them understand what was happening with this plague and which god they had offended. So the councilman by the name of Nicias met with Epimenides, brought him back to Athens, and when Epimenides stepped into Athens, he was shocked at the number of idols in the city. "How many gods does Athens have?" he asked. "Several hundred at least," Nicias responded. "Several hundred," Epimenides exclaimed. "Gods must be easier to find here than men." And I'm reading the text from the historian who gathered all this information in the 3rd century. Aristotle writes about this, so this story is legit. Aristotle wrote about it. Plato wrote about it. Another Greek historian's name that eludes me right now, that's 85 letters long, who wrote about it. So there are bits and pieces of the story all over. And in the 3rd century, one of the historians brought them all together and put this narrative together. So Epimenides said that there's more gods than men. The council explained the situation to Epimenides and said, okay, here's what's going on. We have this plague. Megacles violated his word and slaughtered these innocent people. And now there's a God who's really angry with us. And we don't know him. We don't know his name. We don't know how to appease him. And so Epimenides told the Athenians what they needed to do to appease the agnosto theo, the unknown God. Epimenides said to them, "Learned elders of Athens, there's no need to thank me. Tomorrow at sunrise, bring a flock of sheep, a band of stonemasons, and a large supply of stones and mortar to the grassy slope at the foot of this sacred rock." This was the hill where they were meeting, where the city council met. "The sheep must all be healthy and of different colors, some white, some black. I will now rest for my journey. Do not feed them. They must be hungry. Call me at dawn." And they were kind of incredulous, like, what is this guy doing? Don't feed the sheep, bring a bunch of them, and he's going to take a nap. Wake me up at dawn. So at dawn, a junior member of the council was assigned to carry out Epimenides' instructions, and he came and awoke him, and he said, okay, the sheep are here. And before he began, Epimenides spoke to the council. He said, "Learned elders, you have already expended great effort in offering sacrifices to your numerous gods, yet all has proved futile. I am now about to offer sacrifices based on 3 assumptions, rather different from yours. My first assumption," and every eye was fixed on the tall Cretan. Every ear tuned itself to catch his next words. "My first assumption is that there is still another God concerned in the matter of this plague. A God whose name is unknown to us and who is therefore not represented by any idol in your city. Secondly, I'm going to assume that this God is great enough and good enough to do something about the plague if we only invoke his help." "Invoke a God whose name is unknown," blurted an elder. "Is that possible?" "The third assumption is my answer to your question," Epimenides countered. "That assumption is a very simple one. Any God great enough and good enough to do something about the plague is also probably great enough and good enough to smile upon us in our ignorance, if we acknowledge our ignorance and call upon him. Now," called Epimenides, "prepare to release the sheep upon the sacred slope. Once you have released them, permit each animal to graze where it will, but let a man follow each animal and watch it closely." So you got the picture. All these sheep are kind of in a fold. They're going to be released out on this beautiful grassy knoll. They haven't eaten. They're hungry. And so Epimenides gives these instructions. Then looking to heaven, Epimenides prayed, "O thou unknown God, behold the plague afflicting this city, and if indeed you feel compassion to forgive and help us, behold this flock of sheep. Reveal your willingness to respond, I plead, by causing any sheep that pleases you to lie down on the grass instead of grazing. Choose white if white pleases, or black if black delights, and if those you choose we sacrifice to you. And those you choose we will sacrifice to you, acknowledging our pitiful ignorance of your name." Epimenides bowed his head and sat down on the grass and waved a signal to the shepherds guarding the flock. They released the sheep, which immediately bolted for the succulent grass. "It's hopeless," a frowning councilman muttered under his breath. "It's early morning. I've seldom seen a flock of sheep so eager to graze. Not a one will choose to rest until its belly is full, and then who will believe that it was God who caused them to recline? Epimenides must have chosen this time of day on purpose then, responded Nicias. Only thus may we know that the sheep which lies down does so by the will of this unknown God, and not by its own inclination. Nicias had hardly finished speaking when a shepherd shouted, "Look!" Everyone turned to look and see a choice ram buckle its knees and settle onto the grass without eating. And here's another, roared a startled councilman, beside himself with wonder. Within minutes, dozens of choice sheep lay resting on the grass, too succulent for any hungry herbivore to resist under normal circumstances, but they did not eat. If only one rested, we might have said, "It must be sick," the president of the council exclaimed. But this can only be an answer. And turning with awe-filled eyes, he said to Epimenides, "What should we now do?" Are you getting the picture? So these sheep are released, and Epimenides says, the ones that don't eat, that just lay down, those are the ones that this unknown God has chosen to be a sacrifice to appease him. Right? And so when it started blowing people's minds that was happening, because dozens of sheep were now dotting the hillside, not eating, resting in place. Epimenides had them separate the sheep that rested and mark the spot where it lay. The stonemasons were called in to build altars on those spots, and when the mortar was dry, they would sacrifice those sheep to the unknown God. "Which God's name shall we engrave on these altars?" asked an over-eager junior councilman. All heads turned to hear the Cretan's reply. "Name?" replied Epimenides thoughtfully. "The deity whose help we seek has been pleased to respond to our admonition of ignorance. If we now pretend to be knowledgeable by engraving his name when we have not the slightest idea what his name may be, I fear we'll only offend him." "We must not take that chance," the president of the council agreed. "But surely there must be some appropriate way to dedicate each altar before it is used." "You're right," the learned elder, Epimenides said with a rare smile. "There is a way. Simply inscribe the words, agnosto theo, to an unknown God. Write that on the side of each altar. Nothing more is necessary." The sheep were sacrificed to an unknown God in the hope that he would have pity on them. Then they sacrificed each dedicated sheep on the altar, marking the spot where that sheep rested. Night fell, and by dawn the next day, the plague's deadly grip on the city had already loosened. And within a week, the stricken recovered. Athens overflowed with praise to Epimenides, unknown God. This is quite the story. Over time, the citizens of Athens forgot the miracle done for them by an unknown God. The altars were soon covered with vines and started to crumble away. Nicias, now very old, and the one responsible for bringing Epimenides to Athens, and Demas, the junior councilman who carried out the philosopher's instructions, they decided to preserve one altar to serve as a reminder of the benevolent God's mercy. It was that altar the Apostle Paul saw as he made his way to Mars Hill. And he preached his message in Mars Hill on the very spot where Epimenides and the Athenians sacrificed all those sheep 500 years earlier. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had pity and spared a pagan city of Athens, even though they didn't know his name. That's how good God is. The Athenians would hear no more of this great and unknown God for 400 years until Paul, invited by the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, stepped foot on the Areopagus, the meeting place of the Mars Hill Council, the very same place where Epimenides prayed for mercy centuries before. Going back to Acts 17. "For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? The goodness of God. And starting from there at that point of reference, Paul preached the God of Israel and the Savior of mankind to a people who had once before benefited from his mercy and didn't know it, didn't know him. And he says in 17:24, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all nations. Look at this. Look at the tenor of his message here. Compare that to his preaching to the Jews. And now he was always going back to Moses. Everything was centripetal. And now all of a sudden it's all centrifugal. He made all nations. Athenians. He made us all. This great God did. He appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far away from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. And then continuing, this isn't in your notes, but I'm going to continue reading it. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine is like gold or silver or stone or an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked that stuff. But now, he's revealed himself through his Son, Jesus Christ. And he has set a day where he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed and given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Do you see how Paul took that event in the history of Athens and tied it right into the gospel? Pointing out that you've already encountered this God I'm preaching, you've already encountered him once. Let me tell you his name. Yeah. Is this unusual? Do we have an example of this in the Old Testament? A pagan city by the name of Nineveh that was wicked, worshiping false gods and idols, and the Lord sends a guy by the name of Jonah to it to warn them so that they would repent. Jonah got mad, you remember, because he knew God was merciful. He said, I'm not going there. I want you to wipe him out. Hit him twice. You know. And you know the story. But, yeah. So there's an example of this even in the Old Testament where God took pity on a pagan culture. You know. And there's so many other examples. The Incas have a similar story. The Inca Indians. The Aztecs had a similar story. There's a tribe of about 2 million called the Sandal in eastern India who have a similar story. And the missionaries came and said, the God you've been worshiping, they looked at all these Indian gods and said, no, there's a bigger God out there. And they worshiped him and they had a special name for him. And these Dutch missionaries wound up there and said, we know this God you've been worshiping, we're here to declare him to you. Yeah. Everywhere in the world, the Bible tells us in the book of Ecclesiastes, it says, you have put eternity in their hearts that they might seek you. In the heart of every human being is a desire to know the Creator. It's twisted, it's messed up because of sin. It gets buried, but deep in there is a longing that only God can fill. That's true of cultures. It's true of individuals. Let me see an example of this right here in the Paul and the preaching to the Athenians at the Areopagus. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Paul would say to the Corinthians that Jesus Christ crucified is the wisdom of God. To the Jews, it's a stumbling block. To the Greek, it's Foolishness. To the philosophers, oh, that's silly. To the Jews, how could Jesus' sacrifice be enough? We got all the other law to follow too. They sneered. Others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council, and some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So, a question. Did Paul know about this story? Did he know this history to the altar to the this of the unknown God in Athens? Did he know this when he preached? I think he did. And let me share with you why. I think he knew the backstory to this. First of all, in verse 28, Paul says this, "For in him we live and move and have our being." Do you know where he got that? Epimenides said that. That was in one of his writings. The very philosopher that was the solution to the plague 500 years earlier. Paul quoted him. He also quotes another Greek philosopher by the name of Aratus. He said, where he quotes, he says, "Where we are his offspring." The Greeks had this idea. See, we think of that the Greeks, they were pantheistic and they had all these gods. They did, but they believed there was one supreme God who was good and above them all, who was unreachable and unknowable. Most cultures in the world have that. Even the polytheistic ones. The idea that, all these other gods, that's fine, but out there somewhere there's something bigger, something better, someone good, that they want to reach. So he quotes Epimenides. In Titus 1:12, he says to Titus to scold the church in Crete. Remember that Epimenides was from Crete, from the city of Knossos. And he told them to scold them because of they were lazy and just indulgent and kind of gluttonous people. And he said this, "One of Crete's own prophets has said it, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons." That's another quote from Epimenides in the book of Titus. So clearly Paul was familiar with the writings of Epimenides. And it would make sense. It's not a big leap of faith on my part to believe that he would have known this story of Epimenides' participation in that plague that hit Crete, that hit Athens in the 6th century BC. Isn't that cool? That's as what was our friend on the radio station we were just talking about? Yeah. That's the rest of the story. Right there. That. Right there. Isn't that amazing? How God, even the poor pagans, as he's dealing with Israel, he has his sight on saving all of humanity, not just the Jews. All of us. And throughout history, in cultures that we know very little about, he worked in behalf of people who cried out to him without their ever knowing his name. That's our God. And what should that say to us about our times? I think one of the lies the enemy has in our times is when we think about sharing the love of God with other people who don't know Jesus, there's this kind of hesitancy on our part, like people are just cold, obstinate, and uninterested, aloof. They don't care about the gospel, and yet what I hear in these writings is there's a longing in the heart, that there's a despair in the heart of fallen humanity that longs for reconciliation to the Creator. Now we got a few minutes to finish this up. So Paul moves from Athens, he goes to Corinth, And true to form, he goes to the Jewish synagogue. He does his thing. The Jews get mad at him, chase him out. And this is the point in Paul's ministry where he shakes his feet off from the Jews and said, I am no longer preaching to the Jews. I'm going to the Gentiles. And his ministry began to focus exclusively on the Greeks and the Romans and the people who were not part of the covenant of Moses. Yeah. So Paul comes to Corinth, and he's there for quite a while. He meets a Jew, a refugee from Rome. His name is Aquila, and his wife's name is Priscilla. The Emperor Claudius, that I talked about a little earlier, expelled all the Jews out of Rome. This is about 54 AD. And the reason he did it, and let me read it. I'll read the from Suetonius, a Roman historian. I'll read this, and then you tell me what happened. Okay, a Roman historian says of this event, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, the Emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome. So what do you think what's the backstory there? What do you think was going on? First of all, who's Chrestus? Christ. That's the Latin word for Christ. Okay? So what was happening? Jewish Christians were having conflict with the non-Christian Jews, and the non-Christian Jews were hauling the Christians to court and trying to get them kicked out. And Claudius said, I've had enough of y'all, out. He kicked the Christian Jews and the non-Christian Jews out of Rome. And so Aquila and Priscilla wind up in Corinth and meet Paul. And Timothy and Silas joined Paul a little bit later. And while there, Paul wrote the first of his letters to the Thessalonians, that church that he had founded up there some months before. And Timothy came back with a great report, which prompted a second letter. So Timothy went back up with 2 Thessalonians. And we went through that. We read every single verse of those two books a few months back, if you remember. About a year and a half later, Paul returns to Judea. The Lord had told him, he said, take a deep breath, you're going to be here a while. He was there for 18 months, and he founded the church at Corinth. And then after that, he headed back to Jerusalem, to Caesarea, and then he went to Jerusalem and went up to Antioch. And after spending some time in Antioch, he went back to Asia Minor, to the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. He went back and visited all the churches he had planted, just to check in on all of them. And meanwhile, another Jew by the name of Apollos, a native of Alexandria, that's in Egypt, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he only knew the baptism of John. In other words, he had only been baptized by John, is how I'm understanding that. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him into their home and explained to him the way of God more accurately. They added the rest of the story to what he was preaching. And when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who had by grace believed. For he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. So, isn't that cool? This married couple that's more mature in the Lord takes this very enthusiastic evangelist Apollos under their wing and disciples him a little better, and then they send him off. And look at how the church what it was doing back then, and the getting the message out and just being so wrapped up in each other's lives, That's pretty amazing to me. And that brings us to the end of Acts chapter 18.